If you want this podcast free of ads, follow us now on patreon.com/David McWilliams.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is podcast time, and you know the drill. We're trying to make economics that little bit more accessible, that little bit more open, and hopefully a little bit more relevant. But first, how are you, Ed?
I'm very good. And come here, just before we go any further.
Okay.
Do you remember
Yes,
we were
John.
talking a couple of weeks back with Kev Cunningham about the return or the health of the centre?
Of the centre ground in politics, yes.
Exactly, yeah. And we were talking about, we were using the case study of Dublin Bay South
Yes.
election, which happened last week. And the winner was?
Ivana Bacik,
Yes.
who I'm really, really happy for her. I've known her for a long time. Never really matey, but I've known her for a long time. And when I was in college, she was an amazingly courageous campaigner for women's reproductive rights, for abortion rights, for marriage equality, for a whole slew of liberal issues that have come to pass. But it was very unprofitable and not particularly popular in the late 80s
Yeah.
to be that campaigner. And I've watched her from afar, you know, as she's progressed in her career. Very, very brilliant academic, very young professor.
Well, she's a professor, is she?
Yeah, she's a professor of law. She has the same chair in law that Mary Robinson had and Mary McAleese, two presidents.
okay.
And an all-around decent person. And I'm delighted the Dáil needs people like Ivana Bacik because she's a decent person. She's a clever person.
She's a doer.
She's a fighter.
Yeah.
She's a fighter, you know.
But tell us more about the results then.
Well, what's interesting about the centre.
What does it tell us?
Well, look, we were taking the view a couple of weeks ago. It's very, very, again, unpopular. When everyone says the centre cannot hold, quoting Yeats, and it's going to the extremes. And we were looking at both Germany and France.
Yeah.
Even Italy to a degree, even the UK to a degree. And that a huge part of the population is looking at the extremes now and thinking, nah, not for me, you know?
Yeah.
You know, the world is too fragile for this carry on.
Yeah.
So the momentum of the extremes, I'm not saying it stopped, but the momentum of the extremes, which this time 2 years ago with Brexit and Trump and all these racist parties and the people in Hungary and Poland and everything, not to mention Putin and all these guys, there was a sense that the momentum was behind the extremes.
Yeah.
Now what we're seeing is the electorate is much, much more cautious, has got a stake, or has a greater stake, and is actually voting for the old centre.
More pragmatic.
More pragmatic, saying, look, and I think that maybe Ivana Bacik's victory is part of that story. It's not the only bit of it, but it's part of that story. Anyway.
And the Shinners
didn't do as well as they thought they were going to do.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is part of maybe the centre has got a muscularity that we don't know. But it's an interesting story. We will park it there, but we'll watch it over the course of the next few months, you know. We'll watch it as,
As you said, it's a bellwether for what's to come.
We are as devotees of the radical centre, John. Not the radical left, not the radical right, the centrist dads. Here we go.
Yep.
We're gonna park this, but we're gonna talk this week. Critical question. Is Ireland a tax haven? Huge question.
Yes.
Okay, well there you go. John solved the problem. I was bigging it up. I was being dramatic, theatrical. He said yes. Huge question this week, John, because Ireland broke ranks. For once, we actually stood up for ourselves and said, hold on a second, we are not going to subscribe to a Joe Biden agenda because last time Ireland checked, Joe Biden wasn't elected by us. He's not our president. He's not.
Or was he?
Yeah. No, but it's a fascinating topic, which is that at the moment, the OECD, which never created a job in Ireland once or ever,
Right.
never paid any tax in Ireland, never created any capital transfers, just so I say it, it's a think tank. They have come up with this idea, it's backed by Joe Biden, that we should have a 15% global corporation tax. An aspiration to have it at the moment, right? Nobody knows.
A level the playing field kind of vibe.
And of course, most people expected Ireland to go along with this. But Ireland said no. we're not going to go along with this. And I think the position Ireland's saying is, look, this is an aspiration. This is an idea. There's nothing tangible. There's no negotiation. There's nothing. So why would you back something that hasn't actually been concluded? So when you don't actually know what the tax is, what the idea is. So what I'm going to talk to you today about, John, is why Ireland is not a tax haven, right? The tax, it is an entirely legitimate part of a country's sovereign arsenal to use your tax system as part of your economic offering. It's entirely legitimate.
Yeah.
And to suggest that if you use this and if you stand up for yourself, that you are in some way a tax haven is a bizarre thing. I remember years ago, do you remember I wrote this book, The Good Room?
I do.
Right? And The Good Room was all about when I was a kid, my granny had a good room.
And we all had good rooms, actually.
And my granny's good room was so good that I wasn't good enough to go into it, right? It was kept for people who were gooder than us, right? Like, I don't know, Fine Gaelers or solicitors or something. And I remember my cousins and I would be sitting there on a Sunday with our big tumblers of my waddy, right? In Waterford Crystal, freaked out. And then the good people would come in, right? And
Waterford Crystal.
that we'd never used.
brilliant.
We'd never used. And Granny would give us the Waterford Crystal. And it was myself and the three twins, the triplets, right?
Yeah.
The three twins. And we, as my mother said, were incomprehensible in 2 languages, right? Because they lived down the Gaeltacht, right? And the good people would come in and we'd have to be like little soldiers, not speaking. And the granny would take out the delf from the drawer, and on the delf would be put some sort of cake, right?
Yeah.
And tea.
Nice sponge.
But stuff that we never used during the week. And then when the good people left, the delf was put back into the drawer and locked.
And that was probably only at Christmas.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. So the good room was a mental idea that we weren't good enough, that we couldn't accept that we were what we are. And we tried to pretend that we were posher, right? All Irish families had this stuff. It's deep in our psychology, right? And it's an insecurity that we're not quite good enough. And therefore, we always try to impress the good people.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is a failure. I think this is a fault in Irish people. I think the problem with Irish people is we prefer to be liked than feared.
Yeah.
Right? We always want to be liked. You're great crack and decent, right? What I found interesting about the Irish move last week is they said, no, we don't want to be liked. Actually, we're going to be awkward. We're going to be different. We're going to stand up for what we want.
But will there be a backlash from that?
Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the negotiation, because I don't believe Ireland is a tax haven. If you are a tax haven, what actually happens is a company comes in, puts a brass plate on the wall, washes money through the country, in and out, avails of tax, and then disappears with almost no percolating impact down on the rest of the economy.
Yeah.
That is not the case for Ireland. In actual fact, we can argue, John, that the single biggest change in Ireland over the last 30 years has been on the economic front, the arrival of the multinationals, and on the social front, the arrival of liberalism. And I believe both of them are linked. And I think this is our story. So, we talked about Ivana Bacik there, right? I remember her in the late 80s going around in college campaigning. Now, let's go back to the late 80s, right?
That was such a big time for me.
Yes, go on.
Yeah. Well, actually, it was 88. Where were you, 88?
I was here, but then I was about to leave.
Oh, yeah. And you went off to college in Belgium.
I just couldn't college more. But terrible for swatting that fella. Terrible man for the sums, swatting away.
88 was such a big year for me because I worked on both the Aslan album, the first Aslan album, and a Cactus World News album.
Yes, when everybody was signing Irish bands.
Exactly. And then I went off to London to work in studios over there. In actual fact, one of my first, I remember this,
Are you sure you want to tell the world this?
One of my first recording sessions was with Shakin' Stevens.
Oh, John. I can see you. And this old house.
Absolutely. He was a lovely fella. And it was him and Muff Winwood, who's Steve Winwood's older brother. Both of them played in the Spencer Davis group. But Muff Winwood was the guy who had signed Shakin' Stevens.
Unfortunate first name.
Yeah, Mervyn, I think, was his real name. But he also signed the likes of Prefab Sprout, Psychedelic Furs.
So he was a huge geezer in the music industry.
He was brilliant. I didn't quite realise that when I was sitting there. But a huge argument broke out in the studio.
Between
Shakin' Stevens, Muff Winwood, and other record company executives. And I was just sitting back going, wow, I've arrived.
That's
this
fantastic.
Is great.
Exactly. And the thing is, you had arrived in London, but think of the country that you left. Now, Ireland was extraordinary in the 1980s. There was a boom in West Germany, there was a boom in Britain, and there was a boom in America, and we missed the whole thing.
Yeah.
We were in a permanent recession, right?
Yeah.
In 1988, The Economist magazine had a very unflattering article about Ireland, a headline article called Ireland, the Poorest of the Rich, right?
Right.
And it was basically saying this is a country that is imploding, right? We devalued the currency, the punch, remember the currency? 4 times in a decade. It was like, oh shit, here we go again, right? We had a fiscal crisis. Talent was leaving the country.
Yeah.
Capital was leaving the country. We had a current account deficit. So we couldn't actually pay our way. Interest rates were double digit and our people were just jumping ship, right?
Yeah.
That was the world in 1988. 30 years later, or 32 or 3 years later, right now, the picture couldn't be different. And 1988 is the beginning of the process whereby multinationals began to come here in big numbers.
Let me just ask you that. How did that begin? Like, was there a certain amount of serendipity there, or was it a vision driven by somebody or other? And if so, who was that?
I've always believed that the big man in history is not the right thing. I much prefer the little woman in history, right? So there's always a great thing is when you're going back historically to say, oh, it was Sean Lemass or T.K. Whitaker. No, I don't think that's happened. We got lucky. We got very lucky.
Right.
We began with using tax policy in Shannon. Shannon was set up as a tax-free zone, duty-free zone.
I remember that, yeah.
And airline leasing began, and all sorts of airline businesses began, and they're still here. Like Ireland has got a huge airline leasing business, right?
Absolutely.
And it has the biggest airline in Europe, despite having absolutely no aerospace industry. Now, that's an important point to make. Ryanair is by far and away. So Ryanair is by far and away the biggest airline in Europe.
Yeah.
It flies 4 times more than British Airways.
Right, yeah.
And yet Ireland has never made a plane, a wing, an engine, nothing. We have no aeronautical hinterland.
Right, yeah.
So how did you end up, and we have a country that you could fly over in half an hour.
Yeah.
So how does a country with absolutely no right to have an airline business become the home to the biggest airline business in Europe? This is part of the story. It's an interesting story. It's part of using your head, using your noggin, figuring out how the world works. But it's a good example, right?
Yeah.
So, and again, in the late 80s, Ryanair was only a tiny little thing, right? But I come back to this idea. If you look at the World Development Index, which is a UN development index, what it shows you is that Ireland went from 1990, when Dave O'Leary sent the Romanian keeper the wrong way.
Yeah.
Ole, ole, ole.
Yeah.
Okay. We were the 22nd most developed country in the world, according to the UN. We are now, whether we agree with it or not, the second most developed country, according to the UN. So it takes longevity, it takes health, it takes education, it takes all sorts of other economic variables as well. But it's basically a holistic view of living in the country. Now, we can argue this right.
Who's number one?
Norway.
Oh, surprise.
Yeah. And there are some problems with it, because they use Irish GDP, which is an over. So we could be 5th or 6th if you net out GDP.
Right, okay, yeah.
But we have prepared ourselves, right? Okay, if you take, for example, Slovenia, which is the Alpine Republic on the north of Yugoslavia, which is much more like Switzerland than it is like Serbia. They were 23rd in 1990. They are still 23rd.
Oh, right, okay.
Yet Slovenia has been probably the most successful post-socialist country in Europe. So it shows you how hard it is to actually propel yourself up that league.
Why didn't they?
Because they just stood still, despite doing well. The whole world it's a competition with the whole world.
But so you're saying that one of the key factors was the fact that Slovenia didn't or couldn't invite or attract.
Oh, no, they could. They just didn't do it as well as we did.
Oh, I see.
They just didn't do it as well. But my point is that when the economy is propelled in the society up dramatically in these league tables, something really interesting is going on. Something unique is going on, right? That wasn't going on before. And I think the multinationals are part of that story. They're not the whole story, but they're a really significant part. And if Ireland were a tax haven, right? A tax haven is set up for the benefit of the companies exclusively and a few lawyers and accountants, right? If Ireland was a tax haven, none of the benefits that actually accrued, because the multinationals are real. Like, if you get the dart into Google, right, before the pandemic, and you see hundreds of people getting off the dart going into the Silicon Valley, they're real jobs.
Yeah.
They're real people with real careers. It's nothing fictitious. It's actually, so our industrial strategy. So what Ireland did is it figured out two things, right? Now, this is the question, did we figure it out or we just arrive
I'm curious about that.
I think we got lucky because after the fall of the Berlin Wall, American corporations, everybody had said that what the countries will do really well after the Berlin Wall will be Hungary, former East Germany, Poland, Czech Republic.
Yeah.
That basically companies will set up there to avail of proximity to Germany and Bob's your uncle. What actually happened was American companies realized, globalization will allow us to put our companies anywhere. We'll build these global supply chains. And the American companies, by and large, chose Ireland in a disproportionate way. One of the reasons is because we had this 12.5% tax rate, which was much lower than the rest of the world.
Can I just stop you there and ask you, who was the first multinational to come in here to make that jump? It was a brave
I think the
move.
first big one that we probably know was probably Apple. Apple set up an engineering facility in Cork in the mid-80s because the IDA went out. There was actually a fellow called Michael Killeen, who was a civil servant, went out and said to American corporations, if you come here, you will pay 12.5% tax. We will give you graduates. And remember, Irish wages were much lower than German wages at the time, much, much lower. They're now on a par, which is a great sign of success because, as I've always said, rising wages is what economics is all about. You don't go into economics and say, oh, let's have really low wages, because that actually means you're poor. Yeah. So rising wages. So I come back and I say, okay, let's look at what Ireland figured out. Ireland figured out two things. One is that small countries are always terrorized by the tyranny of size. We're too small. Our local market is too small for us to get rich. We need to trade with the world. Okay. So how do you trade with the world if you've no companies? You've got to attract them in because it's so hard to build companies, right? From scratch. Yeah. But if you can actually attract in companies that already have networks, then you're beginning the process of making your workforce productive. But the question is then, you're too small, so you have to trade. That's the one dilemma. The second thing is you've no capital. Because people forget Ireland was, the reason you're poor is you've no capital, right? So how do you...
We didn't have anything to sell.
Yeah, exactly. We have what we call a beer and biscuits economy. Oh, we did, right? That the only industrial part of the economy was beer, was derivatives of agriculture. Guinnesses and Jacobs. That's all that was going on here. Yeah. Beer and biscuits, right?
I remember sugar beet was a big industry.
Sugar beet was a big industry. Exactly, it was. So let's go back. So you think, okay, how do you do it? How do you attract in capital if you don't have it? You make it much cheaper here than it is elsewhere. How do you make capital cheap? You tax it less. So it's cheaper. Like this is like economics 101. So you bring in the capital, right? All small countries have to do this. Otherwise, the world gets dominated by large countries. Yeah. Which is the tyranny of size. So the bigger the country, the more hard power it has, like empires and all that sort of, the richer it gets. What globalization gave us was this opportunity to say, hold on a second, we can play with the big boys by being part of the global supply chain. So as business becomes more globalized, and this is what the Brexiteers get wrong, nothing is actually made completely in the UK. They buy in parts from everywhere. They assemble things. So globalization means that supply chains are essential, and supply chains need hubs, which are little nodes of hyperactivity. And that's what we became. And therefore what happens is more capital comes in, more talent comes in, and it's a virtuous circle. Yeah. And then you get to the situation, well, is that the description of a tax haven, or is that the description of a clever, far-sighted, maybe lucky industrial policy? And that's what I think it is. It's clever industrial policy. But the commentary in Ireland now, there's lots of people saying, oh, we're a tax haven. This is the ideology of anti-capitalism, I believe, right? I'm not saying everything's pure, and there are lots and lots of compromises we have to make. But let's not let ideology destroy something that has created opportunity for many millions of Irish people.
So what are we talking about here? Explain this a little bit more to me.
Okay, I'm going to give you a few figures to think about, right?
Okay,
The extent
okay.
to which this is not a tax haven and these companies are part of our industrial strategy. Last year, the IDA said direct employment by multinational companies, so people directly in jobs,
Yeah.
right? 257,394 people are directly employed by multinationals, right?
Wow.
That is more than 12% of the entire workforce, right? We're going close to 1 in 6 people here. That's the first thing, right? And this represents an 80% increase in the amount of people working in multinationals from the similar figure 10 years ago. So they're expanding rapidly. 20,000 new jobs were created in multinationals last year alone during the middle of COVID.
Wow.
So these are real jobs. And then you think there's a multiplier, right? So let's say, for example, Intel is building a fab, right? Irish builders build that fab, right? So there's a multiplier that goes out through the economy. And it's been estimated now that 8 other jobs are created in the wider economy for every 10 jobs in multinationals. So this is a huge multiplier, okay? That would give us a figure of 463,000 people employed directly or indirectly by multinationals. That's close to 25% of the workforce. So this is not a tax haven. This is a real thing.
Yeah.
Then you say, okay, that's fine. What about wages? That's people, right?
Yeah.
What does that mean in terms of money in people's pockets?
Yeah.
Wages from the multinational sector are 15 billion last year. 15 billion euros in wages come from the multinational sector. And then if you look at the amount of material they buy in and services they buy in, that's another 2.7 billion and services 7.4 billion. That means 25 billion of aggregate wages comes from the multinational sector every year. Not in total, every year. So this
what's that in terms of revenue for the country?
Well, now let's look at the corporation. Even if you just, right, so for example, if it's 25 billion and income tax, say, is like 40% on average, you're talking about 11 billion in wages, in income tax.
Yeah.
And then you look at corporation tax, how much they generate in corporation tax. This is the one that we all talk about, right?
Yeah.
Corporation tax last year from multinational companies was 11.2 billion. Right? That's 21% of our total tax take. It's huge.
Yeah.
Right? So don't tell me it's a tax haven. This is real money that comes into the country. And then you think, well, what's that money spent on? It's spent on vaccinations. It's spent on hospitals. It's spent on schools. It's spent on real things.
Housing?
It's spent on housing. Well, more of it should be going on housing. But you know, the interesting thing is you can't blame the multinationals for housing. That's our problem, right?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that Ireland has used strategic tax as a weapon to attract in capital, and it has profoundly changed this society. Are we a profoundly integrated part of the global economy? Yes. Do we have a huge presence of multinationals? Yes. Are we unusual in our exposure to multinationals? Yes. But that is a strategic choice that we have made, and from that has stemmed prosperity that would never have been there. From that has stemmed opportunities for Irish workers and for foreign workers as well. Look at JM. JM works here for a Canadian company.
Yes.
You know, so there's lots of stuff going on.
Do you know, we sorry, just a little interject. You know, we were talking about 1988.
Yes.
JM was born in 1988.
Oh, sweet Jesus. Oh, no.
But let me ask you, there's a couple of questions I have for you then. Like, we're talking about the difference between 12.5% and 15%.
Yeah.
It's very little, really.
It's very little unless you have staked your policy on 12.5. If you're talking about a country that hasn't used its tax rate effectively, they don't care because they've nothing to lose.
Yeah.
So think about the amount of European countries that don't do this. They've nothing to lose, right? I mean, what we're trying to do is basically say, we may well sign up to this, but tell us what we're signing up to. At the moment, it's just a set of OECD aspirations. What's it going to cover?
Yeah.
Are you going to actually apply it along the way? Are different sectors going to be different? Where's the money going to go? Like, I mean, the devil is in the detail of all these things. Now, if you have nothing to lose, you don't give a shit.
Yeah.
So there's lots of countries that have nothing to lose, right? They're like, oh, we don't care. That sounds good. Yeah, 15% tax. That sounds okay. But if you have a huge amount to lose by not having the detail of the proposal, then you can't blindly sign up to something just because you don't want to fall out with the big boys. And that's why I said the good route.
Right.
Actually, for once we've said, you know what? We're not going to play this game.
Yeah.
Does it put you in uncomfortable company? Yeah, but that's okay too. Because what you're doing is you're standing up for your interests. And that's what sovereignty is all about.
But so it's been a good news story for us up until now.
Yes.
So we're being called out now. We've been called out for many years.
The New York Times call us a tax haven.
Yeah.
Right? Like Delaware is a tax haven.
Yes.
They don't call Delaware a tax haven. Delaware is an actual tax haven within the United States. Right?
Yeah.
So I think Ireland needs to push back on this because it's important to explain that strategic industrial policy is essential. Like if you listen to Joe Biden, they're all talking about industrial policy now.
Yeah.
They're all talking about bringing companies back from China and giving them subsidies and doing this, that, and the other. They're doing exactly what we did.
Yeah.
Now it's really, Brexit is all about strategic industrial policy. The leveling up and we're going to build industries. It's just they're doing
the same thing.
They're singing our song.
But on that point, then, are we overexposed to multinationals?
Okay,
if you're talking about 1 in 6 workers, if you're talking about 25 billion,
and you're talking about huge amounts of the corporate. Yes, we are. But then what you're doing is you're saying that if the world were to go back to managed trade, if the world were to go back to the 1930s, where companies didn't locate elsewhere, where countries didn't trade with each other, yes, we're overexposed, right? But it's highly unlikely that the world is going to go back to a situation of massive trade barriers. In fact, that's what made Brexit so weird, because it goes against the grain. So it's much more likely that the world continues to be globalized. It's much more likely that capital continues to be mobile. It's much more likely that talent continues to be mobile and move around. And therefore, the chances of multinationals who have done so well here in terms of profitability and in terms of their own balance sheets. I mean, this is one of the great examples of mutual interest, where the companies and this country have done extremely well. And it strikes me that it is critical that we make this point again and again. And do we have to clean up the act on certain things? Yeah. Apple can't be not paying, tax.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, right? Yeah. But to align ourselves with a proposal of which no details have been hammered out, simply because we want to be the best boys in the class, or the model prisoner idea, right? Yeah. We go to jail, we're the model prisoner, we're going to like us, right?
Yeah.
I think is the wrong thing to do, because the story of Ireland and the story of our economy the last 3 decades is the story of openness, supply chains, being part of the global economy, and the presence of multinationals. And we should remember that, or at least not forget that, when we have this national conversation about what we do with corporation tax and multinationals, because there's simply far too much at stake for us to be blasé. Just a quick note to say thank you to all our Patreon supporters. And if you fancy supporting us on Patreon, you can check us out at patreon.com/David McWilliams.